this might sound controversial, I think, to some people. So I'd be interested in your take on this as well, because you've observed a lot of this over the years. I know from your own work. Like there is such thing as a formula that grows a church.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is that it takes a lot of talent, right? Like the magical element is like there's a certain kind of talent that's necessary to grow a church. Talent from, certain kinds of charismatic leaders and musical talent and, production talent and whatever. But when those things come together, you can pretty much guarantee a growth curve, and you can often guarantee a pretty intense growth curve. And so I think there is this thing I remember being at a church conference one time and hearing somebody from the platform say, every time a church grows, it's a miracle. And I just had this check in the back of my head where I was like, no, like we know the levers to pull,
Mm-hmm.
like I had led 2 capital campaigns by then, and I had, we had planted churches and planted different sites. And we always kind of knew like, this is kind of the formula you have to put together. And if you have the formula, people are going to come and it's going to grow and they're going to come from other churches. And, you have to figure out how to manage these things and all of that. So I think that's one of those things where when I think about how we talk about this stuff all the time, I'm like, man, like the church has to be honest about, no, we actually do know how to do this. There's a reason there are books and conferences on growing your church. It does fundamentally come back to a certain kind of talent, but talent isn't character, right? Talent isn't virtue.
Yeah.
Charisma isn't virtue. Those things matter, but if they're not put in check in some way, you're just asking for trouble.
So I guess my next question is there anything wrong in principle with there being kind of levers, mechanisms for growing?
Yeah.
Should we sort of say, no, that's a terrible way of treating the church as a kind of, I don't know, some kind of CEO of a company and you've got your strategic growth plan and everything else? Or is that fine as long as the character of the person at the top is central?
Yeah, I think, man, that's a great question. I don't think there's an easy answer to that question. I mean, what do you think the answer to that question is?
What do I think? I'm the one interviewing you, Mike.
I know, but I'm just, it's a provocative question. It's interesting.
I've always said that I think there are healthy large churches and unhealthy large churches. There are healthy small churches and unhealthy small churches. So I'm not against the idea of large churches and growing churches. And obviously they share characteristics to some extent of what, but you can still get unhealthy and healthy versions of those. And a lot of that is actually about the dynamics going on and the motivations, I suppose, a lot of the time at the top.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I think the thing I would add to it as well is like, there's character, and then there's the way we define our ends, right? So if we think about the different levers you can pull, the quality of the music, the skill of the preacher, et cetera, et cetera. If we think of all of those things as means, then what are the ends that we're after? And if the ends are just as many people in seats as possible, as much money in the bank as possible, if it's, the ABCs, as they used to say, attendance, building, and cash, right? If that's the ends, then you've created a machine that really can chew people up, and you can get really consumed by those growth curves on all 3 of those elements. But if we're defining the ends in different ways, if the ends are defined by real evangelism, not just how many people came, but are people actually getting converted? Are they being discipled? Are we seeing real life transformation? And then are we measuring community? Something I have said for the last number of years is when people say, well, what are we supposed to measure if we don't measure attendance? I always say, I've said this many times, I would love to see a mega church, like a 10,000 member plus church, spend a year where they don't count attendance on Sundays, but they do count attendance at funerals and they count hospital visits. See what that does to the health of your church. Because that's measuring ends. Are you showing up for people in times of real grief and real suffering? Like, keep growing your church, keep doing your Sunday service, keep doing all the things you do to normally grow. but try to figure out what that baseline number is and try to grow that over the course of a year and see what that does to the community. That's that difference between sort of means and ends, and it's a different set of goals that I think is worth thinking about.
I mean, is there a problem that obviously so many of these ministries have been built on the back of very talented individuals, charismatic pastors, people like, as you say, Mark Driscoll, who, whatever you think of his theology or his leadership, was just a very talented speaker and continues to be. And likewise, because I did way back in the day, I mean, this is going back to 2009, believe it or not, I did a kind of radio documentary on another Mars Hill, Rob Bell's Mars Hill Bible Church in, where is it, Michigan. And at the time, he was leading that. And at the time, in 2009, it was the fastest growing church in America. And it was interesting to contrast, him and, say, Mark Driscoll, because they were very different theologically, obviously. Mark Driscoll, very conservative, Rob Bell increasingly leaning kind of more progressive and so on. But there was also a lot of characteristics that I noticed were just common between them. Both brilliant preachers, both very sort of, that they were able to kind of command a room in a certain way and everything else. Again, Rob Bell's ministry sort of ended under difficult circumstances where he kind of was, in conflict, I think, in the end with a lot of his congregation and so on and that sort of thing. Now, I guess my question on the back of all this is there a problem in that sense with the celebrity-driven model of church?